All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison, and welcome back to Web Wednesday. It has certainly been a spell since I've last streamed, just between the holiday and everything else going on. So, welcome back, and I'm really excited about today. So, if this is your first time here, Web Wednesday is all about me bringing on really smart people, or at the very least, people that are smarter than me, which, to be fair, is kind of a low bar, to talk about different web dev topics. And I happened to sort of meet Christos just by a little bit of accident that I wound up kind of running along on a stream when he was supposed to be streaming. And it actually got us to chatting a little bit. And he mentioned the fact that he worked on identity. And identity is one of those spaces as a web developer that, it's something that we need to know. It's something that comes up in many applications, but it's something that very few of us actually know, or very few of us do well. And I'm like, hey, you know what? You seem really smart. You seem to know what it is that you're talking about. Why don't you come on here and let's talk about identity and authentication and security and all of those types of things when it comes to web dev. So bring all your questions and everything else, and let's go ahead and welcome on Christos here. So welcome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining.
First of all, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here.
Excellent. It's great to have you here. So one of the things that I always like to do to start things off is to kick off with the question of how did you become Christos? How did you get to where you are today? What's your background?
Sure. I did my degree in software engineering. I did a little bit of networking for my master's degree, just understanding how networks work, because my dream was to become a hacker. When I first started into this, I was like, I need to know about coding. I need to know about networks so I can hack. And then programming won me over, and I went back to work as a software developer for a few companies. Eventually, I felt confident enough to move into consulting. So I started doing a lot of consulting back in Europe. And at some point, Microsoft reached out and said, would you like to come and work for us as a field engineer? I help customers work with Azure and do some development. And I started working at Microsoft back in 2016. So we're just shy of 5 years of me being at Microsoft. And this past March, I changed roles and I went from marketing back into a technical role where now I work as a PM developer advocate for Microsoft Identity, which means I talk, breathe, sleep, and think about identity most of the time, so you don't have to. How about that?
I appreciate that. If I don't have to be thinking about identity, then that's fantastic. I do want to mention that there is a little bit of question about whether or not you're the real Christos, and if you've picked all of the squares that involve bicycles.
Yeah, I did my captcha, but I used Azure AD to validate that. And it's funny because identity is one of these things that you need to prove who you say you are, and you need to trust that I say who I am. So thankfully, I did not have to show you my ID, my badge, or my passport. But there is this understanding that I am who I say I am. In fact, if you go and check the GAL or Teams, you'll see that my picture matches myself. So at least we can prove that it's me and not JP taking my place on this stream.
All right. We'll take your word for it, and if you can find your passport these days, then good on you. I think mine is back there somewhere, just collecting dust and just being sad.
Do you know where your badge is? I know a lot of people at Microsoft are like, where the hell's my badge? I haven't seen it in 9 months. I don't even know how I'm going to get back into the office.
The only reason I know where it is because I'm one of those that just keeps it in my wallet. So it's just still sitting. Yeah, it's just sitting in my wallet. So but anyway, yeah, your pick matches is with the before the images in Photoshop. So let's talk about identity, since we're kind of joking about, hey, pulling out your passport or looking in the internal catalog for those of you who aren't at Microsoft. The GAL is what Christos was referring to. That's our internal global employee calendar. What is identity? Define that term for me.
Well, before the web, before everything else, identity was for you to prove who you say you are, right? I have an identity, you have an identity, and we have different identities as well. At Microsoft, I am a program manager. At home, I'm a dad. To my friends, I'm a friend. So we do have to wear different identities. And we also need to have a way for proving that my identity is valid. So in the physical world, I did say passports. If I were to travel somewhere else, or if I were to go to a club and I need to prove that I'm over 21, we needed a common way or a common kind of a authority that validates that I am who I say I am, and you trust that authority with some kind of documentation that if I present you my passport, it hopefully it's a valid passport. It's a not a forged passport, and it's a valid authority or issued by a valid authority that says I am who I say I am, and now you know who I say I am, so we can have a common understanding. And you can say, well, you can walk into the club, or you can't walk into the club because you're not 18 or 21, depending on where you are in the world. And that was in the physical world. I had to present some kind of a paper or proof that it meant that I am who I say I am. In the modern world, in the digital world, we still have the challenge of proving that we are who we say we are, whether we need to acquire access to our Outlook. I need to see my email, not your email. And hopefully Azure doesn't mix these things up, or whatever identity system you use. So I provide some kind of credentials. The identity provider validates those credentials and says, well, you should be the only person that has those credentials. And then from that point onward, it issues a passport, a ticket that it passes back to you. So when it comes for us to communicate over the web, you trust that I am Christos, and then the identity provider has issued the appropriate ticket that is identified by both parties. And that's what identity is. It's proving to someone that I am who I say I am.
Okay, so it's effectively then just a digital version of what we used to do, or I suppose still do, depending again on your level of lockdown these days. Sure. Where you take something and you say, "Hey, this is who I am." That you're going to do that exact same thing. Now, one of the things that I heard you mention in there is that there is some level of trust that if I go to a club, which I'm way too old for that.
Way past our time. We have kids now.
Exactly. But if I was to go to a club, the bouncer then at the door, or the whoever it is that's there that's checking IDs, there's some level of trust there that they need to trust that the document that I'm handing to them was issued by an authority that's trustworthy. Does that also then in turn become a thing in the digital world as well? Like, is there a trust that has to be placed in that authority that's going to be issuing the ID? Yeah,
I mean, technically you could grab your own token, you could create your own JWT token and just pass it to anyone. If there's no way for you to authenticate that, or validate that the token is right, then there's no value. So most of the known identity providers, Azure AD, B2C, Okta, Auth0, the well-known identity providers do have a digital signature that comes with the token that you can use also to confirm that this was issued by the valid authority. So it's not just the information that describes who I am, but it also contains information about who issued that information that you can also validate. It also includes things like how long is this ticket valid for? How long is the token valid for? Could be for 6 months, it could be for 1 month. So not only who I say I am, not only what the identity provider was, but also how long is this valid for, right? A lot of things there to check as a developer, or things that you have to think about as you talk about identity.
Okay. Okay, so so then the token. So let me just try and talk through this real quick, and you can
Hmm.
obviously then jump in. So basically, if I go to a website, and that website is going to use, let's say, Facebook authentication,
Sure.
just to use an example here, then
Yep.
what needs to happen is I authenticate it against Facebook. Facebook is then going to give me a token that I can then bring back to whatever website it is that I want. So if I'm looking to, let's say, do some form of an e-commerce store,
Hmm.
and I'm looking to buy whatever, they decide we're going to implement Facebook authentication. I authenticate against Facebook. They give me something then that I can hand off to then the e-commerce store. Is that basically it?
More or less, yes. The only thing that you don't have to do there is for you to actually pass the token back to the website.
Okay.
So it's the identity authority that will pass back the token to the appropriate endpoint, and not the user itself. So the user only does the authentication component. They pass their username and password, and then, or whatever else form they use, or it could be passwordless. And then the authority is responsible for passing the token back to the website, because the website needs to know who I am. Because if it was returning it back to me, I could change the token, change other things, and then pass it back to the website. So now the website doesn't really have this kind of trust, right?
Okay.
We both trust the identity provider, but the flow is slightly different.
Okay. Okay. So to a certain extent, it's basically like Facebook telling that e-commerce store, "Hey, it's okay. You can trust Christopher. I know who he is."
Exactly. That's it.
Okay.
That's in its simplest form.
Okay. Okay. So then, is that in modern web dev the preferred way to do it, or should I be rolling my own authentication? Should I be going in and setting up a database and salting and hashing passwords and doing all of that locally?
You could.
Okay.
You could be using your own authentication, but when you start looking at the complexity of authentication and all the different things that could go wrong, and all the companies that got it wrong up to this point, and every week we get somebody else in the news, then it becomes very, very quickly apparent that we shouldn't be really dealing with this ourselves. And you mentioned certain things like hashing and salting and storing passwords and what have you. There are still developers, there's still people that confuse encryption with hashing. So even storing the basic information correctly can be challenging. And then once you do that, then what happens to your application as it grows? You could go from one user to 100,000 users overnight. So how is your database going to grow to address that? Maybe eventually hit other limits. Then another app comes into play. Oh, now you have to create another user database, or can you use the same one, but you have now new roles for the new application. Now you have to expand the schema just for your identity solution. And then there are other things like, how do you implement two-factor authentication yourself? You have to have an email service, maybe a text service. Then you have to have a way to validate that the code, the 6-digit code that somebody provided as part of the MFA is valid. There is like this super complex scenario. How do you do password resets? And then how can you avoid somebody hijacking your password reset? What happens with DDoS? What happens when 10,000 people try to simultaneously log into the system? How is your system going to handle that? See? Like, there's a lot of complexity there, and you haven't even touched the application yet. You're just talking about the login page. They have to have admins. Like, you have to have admin pages for managing the roles within your identity system, or are you going to let people manage the database itself? Then it becomes super complex, super fast. And I've been to customers where people have left the company for years, and then they could still access production systems because they were still in that database. They still knew the credentials to some live system. So delegate authentication is the way to go. Now,
Okay.
I'm slightly biased towards our Microsoft Identity platform, but I mean, if you are to use something, please use something other than rolling out your own identity. And if you are going to use delegate authentication, then maybe use our service.
Okay. So basically what you're saying is that this problem has been solved. This problem has been solved by really, really smart people who spent the time to do it correctly, use their solution. Don't think, hey, I'm smarter than they are. I can do this better than they can, and I'm going to build my own.
Well, you could very well be, right? I mean, there's nothing stopping you from rolling out the next amazing identity system. It's that the challenges that come with the scaling of the platform. Just to give you a number out there, Azure Active Directory does 30 billion authentications a day.
Okay. So
exactly.
That's million with a B. That's billion. That's
correct.
Okay. That's a lot.
And you know, it's a huge number. I'm not saying that you're going to have 30 billion. I hope that your application gets a million or 5 million or 10 billion. The whole point there is that you as a developer don't ever have to think about how am I going to scale my identity system, right? And identity is not something that people find exciting unless you work for an identity provider like us, and we have 1,500 engineers working day in, day out to solve the complex problems. But in most cases, you know, your manager will come to you and say, hey, Christopher, we need to create a new website. We need to allow people to sign in, whether that's internal users or external users. And then off you go. And then you also have to, you know, create the CSS. You have to decide on the platform. You have to build it. You have to configure it. Identity is just one of the 100 other items that you have to build there. Who wants to spend 3 weeks learning about flows and tokens and protocols and what have you?
I'll pass on that. I actually do happen to know like how that token flow and everything else does work, only because back in like the old days, I did a fair amount of SharePoint dev, and so back when SharePoint started to support single sign-on, I had to then go in and learn all of that, and it took quite a while. And I was doing this as a technical trainer, so I had to learn it in such a way that I could explain it to others, which means that, you know, you need to be able to explain it simply. So that part I know, but and I'm going to get to my question about like how this is actually done then from a developer standpoint in a second. But I do want to highlight that Ina Bakari highlights sort of what you mentioned before, is that if you decide, hey, I'm going to do my own thing, then all you're going to do is focus on making the identity platform rather than what you actually want to do.
Yes. Yeah, you're building a platform for your solution. Yeah,
it's sort of like, hey, you know, deciding I don't like React and I don't like Vue and I don't like Angular. I'm just going to build my own framework from scratch. I'm just going to do this all.
Very similar.
Yeah.
How should we name it? We should come up with a name first.
Although, to be fair, you know, based on how frameworks in JavaScript go, this it seems to be the approach of
let's
many
not
people.
go there.
Yeah.
JavaScript. Yeah.
So then, you know, from a developer's perspective, you know, when I think about, I don't know, my camera won't focus. There we go. You know, when I hear Oauth, when I hear Facebook authentication, and honestly, even as a Microsoft employee, you know, like even when I hear AAD authentication, those words even still even though they are easier to try and build my own, they still put a little bit of fear into my little developer heart.
Sure.
So, like, talk me through that. Like, what is the process? Is it complex? What do I need to know to get that set up?
Well, there are two parts in any authorization, and I don't want to go into protocols. We'll not go into protocols. We will not go into flows. We're not going to go into any esoteric terms, because this is what gets people really upset. Like, oh, all I want to do is just log in my users, right? Why do I have to learn all these things, right? Am I using authorization flow? Am I using code flow? Am I using Pixie? Am I using implicit? Like, I don't want you to know about these things. All I want you to know is that there are two different components when it comes to authentication. If you're using an identity provider or delegate authentication, the first component is you need to go to the identity provider. In this instance, we're going to use Azure AD because this is what we work with. And we're going to register our intent. To do that, as you would do with anything else like Facebook and Google and Twitter authentication, you create an app registration. This app registration shows your intent to Azure AD that you're going to be using it for authenticating users. And since it's Azure AD, it's going to be for internal users or a line of business app. And we'll talk about the external users in a bit, but for now, let's focus on this one. I'm creating an internal app for my line of business solution. Internal users will be logging in. I go into Azure AD and say, you know what, I'm going to have a web app that authenticates users. That's all I want to do. You do that app registration, you get a client ID, and you get a tenant ID or the identity provider's ID. So you go back into your code, and then in your code, you have to use a library. I mean, you could roll out your own OID, OpenID Connect library, but you don't want to do that. So you go, as a user developer, you'll do a little bit of a search, and then you say, I want to use Azure AD. How do I do that? If you are greenfield, if you're starting today, then the recommendation is that you use one of our libraries. So MSAL, the Microsoft Authentication library, is available for most of the major frameworks out there, whether you're doing single-page apps, whether you're doing server-side apps, and we're talking about web apps here, whether you're doing static websites or just a simple HTML with some JavaScript, right? For all these, there's a library that you can use, and then you download the library, and it comes with a few bits of code. We have really excellent samples out there that show you how to do it with React, how to do it with Angular, how to do it with plain vanilla JavaScript, how to do it with Node. And the whole point there is to help you easily on board, right? And you have to write probably about, I don't know, let's say maybe 30 lines of code, 40 lines of code, 4 or 5 lines of configuration, in effect, to have some variables that hold that information for you. So with 30 lines of code, what you get is the ability to authenticate users, grab their tokens. Damn, I thought I was going to say no tokens, but anyway, you grab your information, and then in the application, you get that information. So you get the username, and you have the ability to customize the UI based on that. And if you don't know how to even do that, like if you don't know how to get started, we have a fantastic way I can show you in a bit how you can go into the portal, register an application, and then get a sample that is designed for that application itself. So, without really having to write a single line of code, you get a sample that works against that Azure AD and authenticates you, which is awesome. Now, we talked about all the other complexities that come with that. So with these 2 actions, you get multi-factor authentication, you get conditional access, like who should access my app, when they should access my app, and where from they should access my app. Everybody should use multi-factor authentication. I configure that in Azure AD, and me as a developer don't have to write anything. Somebody has configured that for me. My application is just pointing to an endpoint, and I get prompted for all these things. And then, if I leave the company, then somebody removes me from my Azure AD tenant, and then I don't have access to any of the apps that I had access before. So in one single place, you manage all your users and all your applications. And from a developer perspective, you just need to copy paste a few lines of code, and off you go.
Fantastic. Okay, so and what would be great then, if I'm building then that internal app, is if I'm using AAD, Azure Active Directory, is that people could then authenticate using the exact same credentials that they use to access the rest of the network.
I forgot to say single sign-on. Damn. Thank you. So
You're welcome.
In our line of business, like I work with 95 different Microsoft applications all the time, and in fact, I use Edge, so I'm signed in as my work profile on Edge as well, which means that most of the websites I open inside the company are automatically accessible to me without me having to authenticate. And in some scenarios where I have to re-authenticate, let's say I'm going to HR Web to look at my HR information. Now, I could have left my machine open there, right? And then somebody else comes in the office. Oh, let me check Christos's HR Web information. They wouldn't be able to do that because they will get prompted for another escalation of authentication. If I were sitting on my machine, I would be using Hello, Windows Hello. So it would look at my face and it will authenticate me, and then it will escalate increase the permissions, so it will allow me to go and see my information. And all that is done for free to you. It's offered to you for free as a developer. So single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, complex scenarios that if you were to implement yourself, it will be a pure nightmare.
Indeed. And for anybody who's not familiar, just to real quick define the term of TFA, 2FA or MFA, multi-factor authentication, 2-factor authentication. It's basically it's what everybody should be doing, where you've got your password and then you've got some sort of something else, and that could be a text message. Please don't use text messages. It could be your authenticator app or something else. Or to put this a little bit more simply, it's something that you know your password, and then something that you have, which is typically your phone. And for anybody who's old enough to remember, although these do still exist, I believe, the old keychain tokens that would periodically refresh. It's basically that exact same thing. So it then gives you that additional level of security. Hey, there you go. Yep.
That's a YubiKey, right?
Key fob. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so that way somebody can't just simply guess your password of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which maybe you're using on your login.
Please don't. Hunter 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, password 1, exclamation mark. If I guessed your password while we're on this thing, please go and change it. And please use a password manager, because you should know your passwords. That's the lesson.
Yes. Yeah, that's a huge lesson. Yeah, I password manager. I personally use LastPass, but yeah, use something. Use something.
Yes. Ideally, you should know your passwords. Everything is over 30 characters for me. Although I was registering for an account today for my IoT lights in the room, and apparently I could only use up to 20 characters. So let's talk about that. If you ever come across this kind of limitation, it has to be between 6 and 20. You can use special characters or what have you. Then that's an interesting telltale, right? Because they must be doing something with the password that does not allow them to store in the right information. If you are hashing your passwords, it doesn't really matter what kind of characters there are in the password or how long the password is. But if you're not hashing a password, if you're storing in some other different way, then these kind of limitations show that there is something iffy with the security of the system. So I was like, oh God, I don't want to sign for this, but I have to. So use a password manager, use a strong password, and take care of these things. But that's the lesson.
Yeah.
And eventually we'll probably be at a point that it's all passwordless, so we don't have to ever remember passwords.
I'm still looking forward to that day. One of the things I hate, because again, I use a password manager, so I have really strong passwords, is like when I go to like my Roku or something like that, and I go to add on another service, almost all of them will just direct you to a website with a code, and then I can now just authenticate on my phone. But every now and then you'll come across something where they force you to then type in your password, and it's just such a challenge to then go in and do that. Peeves. Anyway, I do want to ask you one real quick question about the token, and I know that we were trying to avoid a little bit of technical jargon here, but I do want to go back to that real quick. So the website is going to give me a token and do that. What do I need to store that token? Like what do I do with that token? Do I hang on to it? Do I store that in a database? Do I just use it for that one authentication and then let it go away? Like, what do I do with it?
Well, usually most of the systems that you work with, they have some kind of an identity service or layer, right? So if we were to talk about .NET, let's talk about ASP.NET, right? In ASP.NET, you have the identity system. So when you grab the token, you need to tell the session that, or you need to store it somewhere in the session in the form of an auth cookie, right? So you take that token and then you create an auth cookie that is valid for the amount of the time that it was issued for. And then that tells the application itself that, you know what, this user is authenticated. So every time I go from one page to another, I don't have to go and re-authenticate as a user.
Right.
Right. And at that point, the token gets exchanged for an identity object within your solution. And then that identity object is also represented as a cookie within the solution. So for as I said, for ASP.NET, then you can do HTTP context.user.identity, and you can get that information out of your HTTP request without you having to worry about, oh, you know what, they went from one page to another, now I need to retrieve that information again. The one scenario that you might want to store a token is when you actually acquire an access token to go and speak to an API. So it's not very uncommon, especially in the web world, where you have a single page app or a front end that usually calls an API or multiple APIs, and then those APIs can do something else. So for that scenario, you need two tokens. One is the identity token or the ID token that describes who I am. And then there's an access token that explains what I can do or what I have access to. Not every app will have an access token, because if it's just a front-end web app that is running on Angular, and you just go and look at some static information, then you only need an ID token. But if that Angular app needs to call downstream into another API, then it needs an access token. And where that becomes useful is when you store that token. So every time I have to go and call the backend API, I don't have to prompt the user to re-authenticate, or I don't have to go back to the Azure AD tenant and request that token again. And then there are also refresh tokens that say, well, your access token is valid for an X amount of time. When that expires, then I'm going to use the refresh token to go and get a fresh one without really prompting the user again. Think of your mobile app or your desktop solutions. Like, I don't know, Outlook. When was the last time that you signed into Outlook? Because you use that refresh token to go back and get a new access token, so you can go and check your emails without having to authenticate every 5 minutes.
Right. Although I honestly use Outlook Web Access, but that's a story for a different time.
It still does the same thing.
I know.
I use it as well. I got turned a few months ago, and I can never go back. It's amazing. Yeah,
it's fantastic. I really love not having to load everything locally on my system. Ino Bakari says, you explained it perfectly. Essentially, there's one which lets you in the room, and then one lets you use the service, and you don't want that for a buffet. So, yeah,
perfect. Glad to hear that I can explain it well. It took me a while to understand it as well, right? The whole notion of tokens and what and when and how, right?
Yeah. I'm just going to spitball here, but you should really think about getting a job where all you have to do is explain identity to people.
If only somebody would hire me,
Now, in your example, you mentioned identity for ASP.NET. But if I was using Node, then I'd be using Passport, which is, if I understand correctly, a similar library. And he's shaking his head no. So, okay.
Well, it should be a yes and a no at the same time, because I don't think I can convey the same information. Up until this point, Passport was the one way to do it. So there was a Passport extension for Azure AD, as there are Passport extensions for other providers. Now, let me get this clear. We're not opinionated about which library you're going to use. In fact, any OpenID Connect library is a fair game. So if you have built a system with Passport or something else, I don't want you to strip out that code if you are going to use Azure AD. So let's say you migrate from some system to another system, then we support anything that is compliant with the standards. Oauth 2 and OpenID Connect are fully supported. So any library that's built around these, it's a fair game. There's a React. There are a number of React libraries. There are a number of Python libraries that are built from the community. You don't have to use our libraries. However, up until very, very recently, there was a gap in the Node space because we did not have AMSL for Node. But we are in the process of having a preview of that library, and it will soon go into a GA. And the whole point there is that if you are new to Node, or if you're starting a brand new project and you need to authenticate against Azure AD, why not use AMSL? Because it is designed with quite a few things like caching and validating the tokens for you behind the scenes. So sometimes the libraries will take you like 80% to where you need to be, and then they will stop at that 20%. You have to manually roll that out. What you get with AMSL, our libraries, the Microsoft Authentication library, is the full package. It supports everything. Okay.
All right. And then that same thing would hold true if I was going to be doing, say, Flask or Django, that I could use MSAL then for that.
For most of the major frameworks, we have a library, but let's say you're a Ruby developer, suddenly we don't have one. Feel free to let us know if there's a gap in your framework or your language of choice that we don't have. And then obviously it's over HTTP, so you can roll out your own library or use an open source library as well.
Okay. All right. Very cool. Very cool. Now, one of the other things that you mentioned in there, and I do eventually want to get to BDC here in a second, but you mentioned OpenID and OAuth. What are OpenID and OAuth?
Damn it! I put myself in the corner over there. Now I have to talk about protocols. So OAuth 2 is the de facto way of acquiring and passing tokens around.
Okay.
And because it was used and abused, because it was technically used for access tokens, and people were using them to authenticate users, they built OpenID Connect, which is an extension of Auth 2. And in effect, it allows you to acquire ID tokens. So OpenID Connect is ID tokens. Auth 2 is passing and acquiring tokens and validating the tokens behind the scenes. And these are protocols that most of the providers will abide to. So Google will have an OpenID Connect endpoint. Facebook will have an OpenID Connect endpoint. Azure AD has an OpenID Connect endpoint. And as long as you're compliant, it means that I can pass tokens around and people will understand what we're saying.
Okay. I think then that's a perfect transition into, you talked a little bit about how B2B works, how you could do that with an internal. How does B2C work? Like, how am I working with the general populace? How do I implement then Facebook authentication? How do I implement, AAD or Azure authentication? I want to say AAD, but Azure authentication for the general public.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, for the general public. So let's say you have your own company, you have a startup, and you're building a mobile app, and you want your users to come in and create their profile. Or if you're Walmart and you want people to sign up to your website and buy your stuff, and then create a profile and add their information, then you need a way for external users to come into your system to authenticate. At its basic form, out of the box with Azure Active Directory B2C, which is business to consumer or business to customer. The B2C flavor comes with a username and a password. So it's think of it as a username and password database that does everything for you and runs outside your system, so you don't have to worry about scaling and what have you, as we talked before. But then again, you might say, well, I don't want my users to always create a new account. They might want to use a social media account. So you have the ability to add external accounts into B2C. So you give your users the choice to either connect with B2C with a username and password. Sometimes now you can also use your telephone and a password. So it provides you a choice, or they can come in with a Twitter account and sign in. And it creates an association between your Twitter account and the B2C. So in B2C, we'll create an account behind the scenes for you. It also allows you to enrich the information that you capture. So let's say for the first time they sign up, you also want to capture some details about their address or age, and that dictates the flow of the application. So there are two flavors, right? When you have to build an app, you have to decide, am I authenticating external users or internal users? Internal users is Azure AD. External users is B2C. Simple as that.
Okay. So you mentioned real quickly in there about having somebody provide a username and a password. If I use Azure Authentication, am I able to just go, hey, I want my own username and password set up here? Because one of the things for me personally, and I'm now just speaking for Christopher here, that I really am trying to do, especially since I use a password manager, I'm in a lot of ways trying to limit the amount of shared account that I wind up using. I'm really trying to limit the number of times that I use Facebook authentication or Twitter authentication. So that way, if the day ever comes that I want to, close my account, that I don't now have to worry about, okay, well, what are all the services then that I tied this to? And so not saying that I'm ever going to, close down my Microsoft account, my, at live.com account. But if I ever decided to do that, I wouldn't necessarily want to then figure out, okay, well, what other services was I using? And now, figure out how to shut that down or migrate that somewhere else. So if I'm using Azure Authentication, am I able to say, hey, I want to be able to allow somebody to use their own username and password as well as use these other providers?
Yeah, the username and password, I think, is the default all the time. And then the
great.
other ones are add-ons, right? You don't have to use them. It's just a case of you'll start with the username and password database. And then on top of that, you can build and add and extend the platform to meet your customers' needs. But you don't have to. You can just stick to just username and password, and then make everybody else's life very simple. Because in most cases, that's where most people start with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I greatly appreciate that. But there was something I wanted to ask. So if I'm using Azure Authentication, then it sounds like I can use I can then say, hey, I also want Facebook Auth, or I also want I also want Twitter Auth. So I can do all of that through Azure AD, or not Azure Azure Authentication.
Azure AD B2C.
Azure AD
Azure AD
B2C.
is a line of business app or business to business, and maybe I shouldn't be saying that, and I might be confusing things, but we just added, or recently we added this thing called external identity, XID, which allows you to bring people with a Google account or an Outlook account into your tenant, your business tenant. So let's say you, Christopher, have your own company, you're a consultant. Now I need to invite you into my company to build something with my team, but I don't want to hire you, right? You're a consultant to me, so you're not going to get a Contoso library or a Contoso account. You're going to keep your @GeekTrainer account, and then I will allow this external identity to be part of my tenant with specific permissions. So I'm still managing you through my Azure AD, but it is more geared towards businesses rather than indie developers or smaller companies or startups or people like Walmart that want to just have external users coming into the system. So this is for business-oriented scenarios where I need to onboard somebody, but I don't want to hire them. I don't want to give them a Microsoft address. So external identities fills that gap, if you want to call it.
Okay. And but again, that would be more business use.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, I do want to just bring up the fact that I also do have a blue pen floating around as well. The pink pen just happened to be closer, so I do have a blue one as well here. Antillion throws up the question here. So when you authenticate with external identities, what's getting stored? Is it just a token?
It's basic information about the provider. So to be honest, I'm not super perfect aware of how that system works because I have not used external identities, and I'm ashamed to say that. But we do have people that can explain that in detail, like Matthias Hekstra, who used to be in my team. Now he's working for the external identities, and he's super excited to engage with that. So if you really want to know more about external identities, then reach out.
Okay. Do you happen to have his Twitter handle handy?
Oh yeah, I can get it. Let me see. And should we do some demos? Because I think we've been talking for 40 minutes. And
no, that was literally the next thing that I was going to say. It's like, I'm sure everybody is tired of listening to us talk and, highlight, pen colors. Let's see some code here. Show me how this works.
Yeah. And by the way, ping Matthias, I put his handle on the channel. So all your identities belong to us. Yeah. I mean, we try to get all the identities to belong to us, but let's just do some demos. I'm going to share my screen. And let me know when you can see stuff there.
Yep, here we go.
Sweet.
Yoink. Okay.
And right now we're inside the Azure AD portal. So if you authenticate to the portal, in fact, if you don't have an Azure account, if you don't have information about, like, I want to start with Azure AD, but I don't have an Azure subscription, or I don't have an account, there's a Microsoft 365 developer program that anybody can go and sign up, and they get a full Azure AD tenant, including some custom data and sample data, like OneDrive and Graph and SharePoint and Calendar and emails, which allow you to easily come and test things. So right now I'm using my test tenant because quite a few things that we try to do on the Microsoft tenant are prohibited. Like I can't go and read everybody's directory because that would be insane, right? Or I can't go and read things like everybody's email. So certain things that require admin consent, I don't have access to. And that means that certain scenarios I want to cover with customers and you guys are limited. So using a test tenant allows you the full gamut of the access and the privilege that you need. And then when you prove that something is working, you can take it back to your manager or your company and say, well, we need these kind of permissions to be able to build this app. So here, as I said, the first thing that we need to do, and let me zoom in a little bit, is create a registration. This is where it all starts. In this instance, we're going to create a new registration. We'll give it a Reactor demo name. It just needs to be unique here within your tenant, but it doesn't have to be globally unique or whatever. And then we're going to choose accounts in this organization, which means just our tenant. You can also create multi-tenant apps, and that's subject for another 3 hours that we can cover. I'm going to leave the redirect URI as empty. I'm not going to configure anything else. I'm just going to click on register, just to show you how quickly you can get started. Now, at this point, we have the app registration, we have the client ID that we talked about, and we'll have the tenant ID. But let's say I don't know what all this is. All I want to do is just get started quickly, right?
Which is good, because I don't know what any of that is. I just want to get started quickly.
Yeah, it's esoteric terminology that we put there to confuse people. That's how I can explain it. Now,
mission accomplished.
Thank you. We're doing good, right? So we have a quick start here that says, hey, what do you want to build, right? If you were to build something and you don't know what you're building, is it a web application? It's a mobile. You can do a single page app, and then you can do daemon, and then something else. But let's go with Node. Oh, we added preview here. I like that.
Hey.
Well, you know what? I want to maybe go back into quick start and say maybe do. Can I close this one? I think I can close this here.
That is always one of the fun things about doing demos on Azure. It's every now and then they'll update something while you're doing a demo. Like, oh, that's now here. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that with Node, as I said, it was private preview, so we didn't want to push too hard in case people started using it. Like, oh, this is not working, or this is not good. But we're approaching that point that now that we can do it. So it's great to see that it is there. So here I'm going to say we're going to use JavaScript, right? Just a plain vanilla JavaScript. I'm going to click on that, and it says you need to do some changes to configure your app registration, and that's fine. What it will do for me is configure my redirect URI to be my local host. So I will make that update, and then all I'm going to do is just click on the download the sample, which comes down. Let me just grab the unzipped file and paste it somewhere that we can work with. And then I will open that and run inside, or we'll put inside Visual Studio Code so we can see what it looks like. Just adding it there. So if I do this, let's say ls. And then here we have MS Identity, JavaScript. I'm going to switch to that. Let's open this in code just to look at the code, right?
Let's see. This is what you just downloaded. This is what you just grabbed.
That is correct. Although I think I opened the wrong one. Yeah, it shouldn't be B2C. Sorry. This is what I downloaded, but not that one. To the MS Identity, not the B2C one. I mean, we can do B2C if you want to, but and then code.
If you've got a B2C handy, I'd love to see that as well if we've got time. But let's keep doing what you're doing there.
We got time. I don't want to look at the UI. Let me just make this bigger so everybody can see. There are quite a few files here, but there are two main files that we care about. One is the Auth Config.
Okay.
And this is where we actually store. You remember how we talked about the client ID and the tenant ID? This is what it's configured here. The redirect URI, remember we talked about localhost 3000. In effect, what we said to the app registration, once you are ready to issue the tokens, send them back to this redirect URI. We'll be listening here to accept the tokens. Identity, we're doing identity for web. I mean, we're doing identity in general. We talked about identity in general, but right now we're doing a demo with Vanilla.js and a little bit of Node behind the scenes. So we have the, go on.
Sorry. So the redirect URI, when I push to production, that would obviously need to be updated. So I'm guessing I would want to offload that to settings. The client ID and that authority ID, is that something that is okay to have in the source code, or is that something I should also go ahead and
this is not sensitive information. The tenant ID is a well-known ID, especially if you're using the Microsoft tenant. This is just a tenant ID. So there's nothing that can be used or abused to hijack your system.
Okay.
If there was a client secret, then that would be a different story, because that client secret now can be used to run and acquire tokens. Now, you talked about the redirect URI. The nice thing here is I can have multiple of them. So you can have one for local development, and I can go and add another one. Sorry, no, I shouldn't add platform, but I can go and say, you know what? In production, it's going to be HTTPS. And by the way, you can only do HTTP with a local host. You can't do HTTP with a public domain or any DNS that is not localhost.
Which is good because everybody should be using HTTPS on everything.
Yep. So you see here that if I were to add another URL, it will make sure that it is unique, that it is a valid URL, it has HTTPS, right? I mentioned that. And then you can have multiple of these. So you don't have to change or create a new app registration for every single environment.
Yep.
So once I have that one, remember, that's the information I need here. And then it also says, store the session, use the session for my my storage. That means that if I open multiple browsers with HTTP localhost 3000, then I don't have to authenticate on all these browsers because it's stored in the session. And there are different options that you can decide here for your CAS. But technically, 5 lines of configuration, right? That's it. I'm not lying there. And then for my authentication, we have 2 different options. One is, so it says, if you add multiple URIs, do you have to add them to the config here? No. I assume that if you're running on localhost, then you have one URI. Well, sorry, let me go back here. I think that's the question for the config. This one is not, this one will change. Yeah, so if you are running here, you can only have one redirect URI. So if you're running local, you have to have this one. If you go to production, you need to replace that. So either make it configurable or something that your CI/CD sets as a best practice. So you don't have to worry about, I moved to another environment. I need to remember how to go and change it. This is a little bit of a sample to get you started. It doesn't always follow the best practices, especially when you need to make an app more enterprisey, right? Ideally, in a production environment, you're using a CI/CD to push this information ahead. So there are 2 ways to authenticate when it comes to JavaScript. One is with a redirect. So your page will redirect to another page, and then you'll come back to your current page. Or you can do a pop-up. And the pop-up just presents a nice window pop-up for you to authenticate. Once you authenticate, it hides away, and then your page comes back. So I think by default, we use the pop-up down here. So the pop-up, yes, sorry, go on.
You got a modal built right in there.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
So in the pop-up, and then we give you both. So if you change your mind, you can just go to the redirect. You just change the referenced script in there. And here we have 2 different things. I mean, it's probably more code that you need to, but technically you have a sign in. This is like a 2-liner or a 1-liner that says present the pop-up, and then if everything is correct and done, handle the response, which in effect changes the UI a little bit. But if there is an error, then show the error. And there's a sign out, which is also 1 line. And then there's a get token, which is for calling graph later on. But should we run the app and see what happens?
Yeah. What's the worst that can happen?
What's the worst that can happen? Exactly. It won't run, but it's fine. npm install. In fact, it did say that in the portal, but we jumped out, if I remember correctly. Did we? I think where is my portal? If we go back to the quick start, we might have lost the information now, but it says first thing you need to do is npm install and then npm start. So let's do our npm start as well. So this is now listening on port 3000. So let's go to that lovely port and see if that works. There you go. That's our page. And the website's up and running. There's a nice sign in at the top. So let's sign in. Now I'm already authenticated with that account. So let's click on that. Oh, check this out. Now it says this is the first time that you're logging into this application. You need to approve some permissions. And because the default one is for the application to be able to read my profile, it asks for that permission. It also asks for permission to read the profile and then read the data. I can also consent on behalf of my whole org if I wanted to, if I were an admin, which I am for my tenant. Means that other users don't have to see this one. I will accept it as an admin.
Okay.
I don't get to see that consent. And then finally, I will say accept, and it will authenticate me. Now you can see my name here. It's brilliant, right? But let's say I wanted to go and see my profile. Now, so far we've done the ID token, but I don't have any access token to go and speak to Graph, because for my profile or my emails, I need to get access to Graph. So if I say see profile, we already approved that. But for my emails, And this is fantastic, by the way, because in the old world of Azure AD, we got consent for everything up front. And that was okay, but let's say I only want my app to see my profile. I don't want it to be able to see my calendar because I don't want to use that functionality ever in the app. And unfortunately, I had to consent to everything. So sometimes you might get a whole list of this app is going to get your contacts, your email, whatever. Like, no, I don't want to touch that. But now with the V2 endpoint and Azure AD and Microsoft Identity, you get incremental consent, which means that unless I want to give them permissions to go and increment the consent, then it won't have access to my information. So at this point, I say, you know what? Yeah, you can go and see my email. Nothing conspicuous there. And again, because it's a different set of permission, it says I need to have access to read your email, and I'm happy with that. So I will accept it. And you only have to do that once per app. And now, lo and behold, all my emails are here.
Okay.
So this was the Azure AD. You said you wanted to see the demo for, or at least see the code for the B2C, right?
Yeah.
The different flavors. So let's open that one.
Yep.
And then before we close, I want to do the very quick demo for .NET or ASP.NET developers. So CD and then CD MS Identity B2C. And then let's open this in code. It's slightly different. In fact, the reason why I have this sample over here is because somebody said I was trying to do a password reset inside B2C and I couldn't do it. So I was like, oh, well, let's put a sample together. So in this instance, you notice that there are some policies. Again, these are the constants that keep some information. We start with a config, very similar to what we had before, right? It almost looks like the same sample. We have some slight different information when it comes to B2C because the well-known endpoints are slightly different. We also need to provide known authorities. And that's information that MSAL requires. So if you go into the sample, if you go to the docs, you'll find where that information needs to come from. And the difference with B2C is you need to point it to where the sign-in page is. Unlike Azure AD, which is always the same, with B2C, you can have a customized page and look and feel for your page. So in that case, you might have a different endpoint for on one specific application than a different endpoint or sign-in experience for a different experience. So we want to provide you with that. That's the reason why it's different. And then we're using the Auth authority pop-up or the Auth pop-up file again, which is slightly customized. And what I did here is, again, we have the handle response, which will change the UI for us and put our name there. We have a sign-in, and this sign-in now, it does a login pop-up. It will present the pop-up. But if the user clicks on, you know what, I forgot my password, then in that case, it throws an error. That error has a very specific code. So we're looking at the code and say, well, the user does not want to sign in. They forgot their password. Redirect them. Okay. So the login pop-up will point you to a different location, which is the forgot password. Then you do the password change, it handles the response, and then it comes back to the portal. The logout is very, very similar. And then that's all it does. In effect, there's not a lot of code. And you know what? Even down here, I put an edit profile. So if you want to go and change your profile, it's again a one-liner. So a lot of information out of the box that you don't have to worry about. Just knowing what to put in there and how to put it. But technically, with all that, I get MFA, I get conditional access, I get the ability to add any user I want into my system without having to write a lot of code.
Okay.
So,
and the bulk of that is boilerplate code that I can go through that same process and get, here's your starter code, just go grab this and away you go.
Exactly. You don't even have to write that. Just do a copy paste, point the right tenant and the client ID, and you're done.
I love it. That's awesome.
And let's do one for our .NET fans, right? So let's do CD app, and then let's do make dir. We'll create a new directory. And CD demo 2. And then in here, what I'm going to do is .NET new. So if you're a .NET fan, you probably know the CLI. You can do it from Visual Studio. You can also do it from Visual Studio Code. .NET new web app. And then I'm going to say auth single org. This is going to create a new Azure Pages ASP.NET application with authentication baked in. And I'm going to quickly change to the code just to show you that we made it even better for ASP.NET developers with a single one line of code doing everything for you. So again, you have a configuration file. This in effect says the application where to go and authenticate users against. You need to change the tenant ID and client ID. You can also populate them as part of the CLI, so you don't have to do it after the fact. If you know them beforehand, just add them to the CLI and it will do it for you. And then inside my startup, there is Chris, you lied. There's 2 lines of code that wire up the authentication. But you know what? I can do one better. I can do add Microsoft Web App Authentication with configuration. And if you kept everything as default, then that's your one line. See, I wasn't lying. So you have this one here, and then you have the UI. Like, what do I do when I need to sign in? You don't have to create sign in and sign out pages. All you have to do is just use the built-in UI elements in the DLL. And that will allow you to run the app and authenticate users without having to do anything else.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Cool. How
are we doing with time? Are we 4 o'clock or 4:30?
So I do need to close off here. Code Rashawn was just messaging me in the background, so I was just replying back to him. He mentioned that you're going to be doing something tomorrow. So in fact, here, let me give you an opportunity. Plug your show, plug your Twitter handle. Where can people find you?
Email us at 45show@microsoft.com. You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is just below my name, so you can easily, or at the bottom left-hand corner as you see the stream. We're always happy to respond to you. We do have the 45 show on Mondays and Fridays at 8 a.m. Pacific here on Microsoft Developer and 45 show, so we multicast. And tomorrow we're doing a session at the Tulsa user group, where we'll be talking about identity and maybe taking a different path down identity for you. So join us anytime you want. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to support you in your identity journey and help you to get it right.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much for hopping on. I know that you've answered a lot of questions for me. So this was spectacular. So yeah, that Tulsa.net user group, Christos and JP, I apologize, JP are going to be the presenters there. And you can also check out the Microsoft Reactor Twitter handle. I do Web Wednesday every Wednesday. We are going to be offline next week, but the week after, I'm going to be bringing on Jen Looper to talk about Tailwind CSS. Which I know exists. I know it's something cool. I know that it's supposed to be, I'm going to say different than Bootstrap. I'm not going to say better. I'm not going to say worse. I'm just going to say different. And that really is the goal here. It's like, hey, let's talk about things that we as web developers need to know, but we don't necessarily always have the time. Let's ask smart people like Christos to come on and have these conversations. So Christos, again, thank you for taking the time to do this. It was fantastic. I know I learned a lot, so hopefully a lot of other people did as well. So thank you.
Glad to know that. Thanks for having me again. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope to see you around in one of the many activities that we do. So yeah. Thanks. Have a nice day.